January 17, 1945. The bitter wind slices across a snow-covered POW camp in northern Germany. Barbed wire stretches like frozen serpents under a gray sky. Inside the dim wooden barracks, the women huddle together, shoulders shaking not just from cold, but from fear. Their clothes are thin, threadbare, and their faces carry the wear of months, some years of captivity. The distant rumble of artillery shakes the ground, a reminder that the war outside moves relentlessly forward. A faint melody pierces the winter silence, drifting from a small, scratchy radio someone, perhaps a soldier, has hidden near the fence. At first it is barely audible, a fragile whisper among the cracking static. But as the notes grow clearer, something stirs inside the women. Eyes widen, lips part. Tears, long restrained, begin to form, shimmering in the dim light. The music, strange, bright, alive, speaks in a language more powerful than words. It is American jazz swing, the sound of freedom itself. For a moment the camp falls silent, every heartbeat tuned to the melody. In that fragile instant, the war outside seems both impossibly distant and painfully close. The women's tears mark the beginning of a new kind of liberation. War environment and POW experience. By the winter of 1944, the tide of World War II had shifted decisively. The Allied forces were advancing through Western Europe after the Normandy landings, while the Soviet Red Army pressed from the east. Germany, once confident in its unchallenged dominance over the continent, now faced encirclement and devastation. Air raids had become routine, reducing towns and factories to rubble, while front lines crept ever closer to the heart of the Reich. Within this collapsing war machine, the lives of ordinary people, especially prisoners of war, hung in precarious balance. Female prisoners in German camps, though fewer in number than their male counterparts, faced unique hardships. Camps such as Stalag 3D near Nuremberg or Stalag 2B in Hesse housed women from occupied nations, French, Polish, Soviet, and even some British civilians caught in the tides of conflict. Life inside these camps was dictated by strict military routines, overseen by German guards trained to enforce order with little regard for compassion. Food was scarce, hygiene was poor, and medical supplies were almost non-existent. Illness spread quickly, and the bitter winter only worsened the suffering. These women were often forced into labor. Tasks varied from mending uniforms and preparing food for the camp to working in nearby factories under harsh supervision. Each day blurred into the next, punctuated by roll calls, shouted orders, and the ever-present watch of armed guards. For many, weeks passed without meaningful human contact beyond their fellow prisoners. Letters from home were rare, and the news from the outside world arrived only through rumors or the occasional clandestine newspaper smuggled into the camp. Psychologically, captivity imposed its own relentless pressure. Isolation and uncertainty eroded hope. Guards sometimes used intimidation or even physical punishment to reinforce compliance. German propaganda reinforced a narrative of hopelessness, warning prisoners of Allied defeats or exaggerating the strength of the German war effort. The women endured a constant tension between fear of punishment and yearning for freedom, a delicate balance that could be shattered by a single unexpected event. In parallel, the Allied advance into Germany added a new dimension of anxiety. As news of the front lines trickled in, prisoners became acutely aware of the shifting power outside the barbed wire. Rumors spread quickly. Towns liberated, soldiers advancing, German units retreating. The camp, once seemingly permanent, felt increasingly fragile, suspended between the remnants of German authority and the imminent arrival of liberating forces. Guards grew more anxious, their discipline cracking under the pressure of impending defeat, sometimes leading to uncharacteristic behavior, erratic, cruel, or even desperate attempts to maintain control. Despite the harsh conditions, small acts of humanity persisted. Prisoners formed tight-knit communities, sharing scraps of food, warmth, and news. They whispered songs from home, exchanged stories, and held onto fragments of their identities in a world that sought to erase them. For these women, survival, depended not only on physical endurance but on maintaining the fragile threads of hope. It was within this context of deprivation, fear, and longing that the first strains of American music would pierce the monotony, a moment that would awaken emotions long suppressed. As the Allied armies approached, the psychological environment shifted subtly but profoundly. The women, already attuned to the sounds of distant artillery and the occasional aircraft, sensed a change in the air. The wind seemed to carry not just the cold of winter, but the whispers of a world beyond the camp, a world that promised liberation, even if only in small doses at first. In these moments, the stage was set. The environment of fear and deprivation created a profound contrast, heightening the impact of something as simple and yet as transformative as a melody carried through the frost-bitten air. Music for these women would become more than sound. It would become a tangible reminder of freedom, of life outside the wire, and of the humanity that the war sought to suppress. The arrival of the first musical notes was not merely a sensory experience. It was a psychological tremor, a prelude to the liberation that would soon reshape not only their days but their understanding of hope itself. Cultural and psychological. Context inside the German POW camps, life was not only a physical struggle, it was a battle for the mind. The women had been immersed in an environment carefully controlled by their captors. German authorities monitored every word, censored all written material, and strictly limited access to news or foreign influences. Radios were generally forbidden or confiscated. Newspapers were propaganda-laden, designed to portray the Reich as invincible and the Allies as desperate and defeated. Outside the barracks, signs of the collapsing German war machine seeped through, but the prisoners could never be certain which accounts were true. For months, some of the women had heard only German military marches, patriotic speeches, and harsh orders shouted by guards. Even music, a universal human comfort, was tightly regulated. Classical pieces approved by camp authorities were occasionally allowed, but they carried no message of liberation or hope, merely background noise to maintain order. Any contact with foreign or enemy culture was a serious breach, punishable by solitary confinement or the removal of privileges. Over time, the women internalized this silence, resigning themselves to a world stripped of color, sound, and freedom. Yet human resilience is subtle but persistent. Within the barracks, prisoners shared what little cultural memory they had. Some hummed lullabies from home. Others whispered songs they had remembered from childhood or from fleeting encounters with Allied broadcasts smuggled through the camp walls. These fragments of music became private lifelines, moments of identity and dignity in a place designed to erase both. A single memory of melody could evoke laughter, tears, or the sharp pang of longing for a life now suspended in limbo. Meanwhile, the Allies had recognized the psychological impact of music. Propaganda broadcasts, like those from the American-run Voice of Liberation programs, were designed to reach enemy populations and occupied territories. Jazz, swing, and patriotic songs were intentionally chosen for their energy, optimism, and emotional resonance. Unlike German military marches, which often reinforced obedience and hierarchy, these American melodies conveyed freedom, individuality, and the possibility of survival. Soldiers on the front lines sometimes carried small radios or phonographs, playing music not only for themselves but, inadvertently, for those trapped behind enemy lines. The cultural shock for the prisoners would be profound. For women who had been conditioned to expect only silence or harsh command, the sudden intrusion of unfamiliar, lively music would be startling, almost unreal. It was not merely entertainment, it was a signal that the world outside the wire still existed, that life beyond captivity was tangible. A few of the women, who had never left their hometowns or had limited exposure to foreign media, were hearing jazz and swing for the very first time. The rhythms, improvisations, and bright timbres clashed violently with the monotony of camp life, creating a psychological rupture as powerful as any physical liberation. This sensory experience carried with it complex emotions. Relief and joy intertwined with disbelief and nostalgia. The music reminded them of home, of freedom, of the lives that the war had suspended. It also highlighted the contrast between oppression and liberation, evoking sorrow for the months of suffering endured and gratitude for the forces advancing beyond the camp. Some women wept quietly, while others sat in stunned silence, unable to process the new sensations. The human response was raw, unmediated, and deeply revealing of the mental toll of prolonged captivity. German guards, too, were affected, though differently. Accustomed to control, they struggled to understand why a simple song could so disrupt the order of the camp. Some reacted with irritation or attempted to suppress the experience, while others were caught off guard, quietly observing the unintended power of sound over human emotion. For a moment, the rigid hierarchy of captivity faltered under the invisible influence of music. The stage was now fully prepared. The physical deprivation of months in the barracks, the psychological conditioning of silence and fear, and the strict cultural isolation all converged to amplify the effect of the first American melodies. What followed was not just a musical experience, it was a profound emotional reckoning. These women, confined by barbed wire and oppression, were on the cusp of a moment that would transform despair into the fragile, radiant hope of liberation. The next scene would capture that pivotal instant. The first notes of American music reaching the ears of the women, their reactions immediate and undeniable. A human story entwined with the tides of war. Angles. Section 1. Human and Tactical Perspectives. The first angle to consider is the human one, the raw, unfiltered response of the female prisoners. Years of captivity had stripped them of choice, routine, and often hope itself. The sudden intrusion of music into their confined world triggered something deep and immediate. Eyes widened, breaths caught in throats, and tears fell without shame. For some, the melodies evoked memories of home. A mother's lullaby, the laughter of siblings, the streets of a familiar town now distant and war-torn. For others, the rhythm sparked a bewildering mixture of disbelief and joy, a sensation so alien it bordered on shock. The music reminded them that life outside the barbed wire still existed, that humanity had not been entirely erased by the machinery of war. From the tactical perspective, the timing and impact of this encounter were no accident. American forces had long understood the psychological potential of music in war. Beyond traditional propaganda, melodies could serve as a form of psychological operation, a subtle tool to weaken enemy morale while bolstering the spirit of the oppressed. Though in this case the music reached the prisoners almost incidentally, its effect aligned perfectly with military objectives. The advance of Allied forces into German territory was accompanied by broadcasts and recorded music, designed to reinforce hope among those still under German control. In liberated zones, soldiers sometimes used portable radios and phonographs to play songs, creating an audible signal of freedom even before physical liberation could occur. Leadership dynamics within the camps added another layer to this angle. German commanders and guards, trained to maintain strict discipline and suppress individuality, were suddenly confronted with the intangible power of music. The women's reactions undermined authority in subtle but undeniable ways. Where previously a shouted order or threat of punishment would elicit compliance, now the prisoners displayed emotion that could not be disciplined or contained. For camp leaders, this was both perplexing and alarming, a reminder that control over the human spirit was never absolute. Music, an element entirely outside their command, had become a force they could not predict or suppress. From a human standpoint, the scene also underscored resilience and communal solidarity. As the melodies drifted through the barracks, women instinctively gathered closer, sharing in the experience collectively. Tears were not private. Laughter or quiet murmurs of recognition rippled through the rows of beds. For a moment, the camp transformed from a site of oppression into a space of shared humanity. These fleeting instances of connection carried profound psychological significance, fortifying prisoners for the final stages of captivity and eventual liberation. Tactically, the incidental nature of this musical encounter reveals the broader interplay between war and human experience. Soldiers on the front lines were focused on logistics, supply lines, and combat operations, yet the simplest actions, a record played, a song broadcast, could ripple through enemy territory with effects more enduring than any military maneuver. The psychological terrain of war was as critical as the physical. By influencing morale even unintentionally, music could alter the emotional climate of a prisoner population, easing surrender, compliance, or readiness for liberation. In combination, the human and tactical angles illustrate the multidimensional nature of this event. It was not merely a moment of emotional release, but also a subtle intersection of warfare strategy, human psychology, and leadership response. One could trace the impact of a single song through the layers of fear, hope, and authority, revealing how intangible forces, sound, memory, emotion, interacted with the tangible forces of gunfire, barbed wire, and military hierarchy. By observing these layers simultaneously, we gain insight into why such an ordinary cultural artifact, music, could hold extraordinary power. It was a reminder that even amidst war, human beings retain a sensitivity to beauty, rhythm, and memory. The prisoner's tears were not signs of weakness but markers of endurance, proof that hope could survive even the harshest environments. And from a tactical lens, it was evidence that warfare extends beyond bullets and battalions. It encompasses hearts, minds, and the subtle psychological currents that define human behavior. This perspective sets the stage for additional angles: technology, enemy reaction, and moral implications. Together, they provide a full understanding of why the simple act of playing music became a turning point in the lived experience of these women, and why historians continue to study such moments as a testament to both human vulnerability and resilience. The emotional resonance of the women's reactions naturally leads to a discussion of the technological, enemy, and moral angles, the next layer of understanding. Technological, enemy, and moral perspectives. From a technological perspective, the story hinges on the tools that delivered sound across the distance of war. Radios, phonographs, and portable record players were more than entertainment devices. They were instruments of influence. In 1945, access to foreign broadcasts or recordings was strictly limited in German-controlled areas. Allied forces, aware of the psychological weight of sound, sometimes used these devices deliberately to reach enemy populations or liberated zones. In the case of female POWs, the music often arrived through improvised means: a hidden radio smuggled by sympathetic soldiers, a phonograph carried in by advancing troops, or even a record played over a camp speaker. The technology itself was simple, yet its effect was amplified by months of enforced silence and cultural isolation. Every crackle of static and each scratch on a record became part of the emotional texture, heightening the intensity of the experience. From the enemy perspective, the reactions were complex. German guards were trained to maintain discipline and suppress emotional displays, but music introduced an uncontrollable variable. In some cases, they attempted to stop the broadcasts, shouting orders or removing the equipment. In others, they observed silently, perhaps uncertain whether to intervene. The presence of American music challenged their authority without a single shot being fired. For the guards, the women's reactions, tears, laughter, whispered memories, were a subtle but undeniable rebellion. Music exposed a vulnerability in their control, demonstrating that human morale cannot be dictated solely by rules, punishment, or fear. The moral angle underscores the profound humanity embedded in this story. Music, a cultural artifact, became an instrument of hope. It was a reminder that even amidst the cruelty of war, individuals retain the capacity to feel, to connect, and to recover glimpses of dignity. For the prisoners, these moments were not trivial. They were morally significant, affirming that survival is not just a matter of physical endurance but also emotional resilience. The act of listening, of allowing oneself to respond to beauty, was a form of quiet defiance, a moral assertion that oppression cannot erase the soul. Technologically, morally, and psychologically, these experiences reveal an intersection rarely captured in traditional histories of warfare. The focus often lies on strategies, battles, and casualties, but the influence of cultural transmission, sound, art, memory, shapes human experience in ways equally consequential. A single song could rekindle hope, restore identity, and prepare prisoners for the challenges of post-liberation life. In this sense, music operated as both weapon and balm, a dual force that exposed the enemy's limitations while healing the oppressed. These angles also highlight the broader implications for leadership and strategy. Military authorities, whether Allied or German, underestimated the power of intangible elements like music and morale. Soldiers and officers focused on tactical objectives often overlooked the psychological currents that could accelerate surrender, inspire resilience, or provoke subtle rebellion. In the case of the POWs, the emotional impact of American music was amplified precisely because it disrupted the expected order, introducing an element of unpredictability that no map or battle plan could account for. Viewed together, the technological, enemy, and moral perspectives deepen our understanding of why a seemingly simple act, a record spinning, a melody filling a barracks, had such profound consequences. Technology enabled the delivery of sound. The enemy's reaction revealed the limits of control, and the moral dimension illuminated the enduring human spirit. Each angle reinforces the others, creating a multi-layered narrative that transforms a single musical encounter into a pivotal historical moment. As the women absorbed the rhythms, harmonies, and energy of the American songs, the stage was set for the climax. This moment was no longer merely about survival or endurance. It was about emotional liberation, cultural revelation, and the undeniable human response to freedom. The upcoming scene would capture the crescendo of these forces, the first full American broadcast, the soldiers' approach and the prisoners' tears, laughter, and awe. Arrival of American forces in First Music Broadcast, March 1945. The landscape of northern Germany is scarred, burned-out buildings, shattered roads, and forests stripped bare by artillery fire. The war's front lines creep closer to the POW camps. Guards move with an air of tension, their previous confidence replaced by uncertainty and fear. Rumors circulate Allied soldiers are near. Some camps have already been liberated. Inside the barracks, the women sense the shift, though their daily routines continue with rigid monotony. The cold winter air cuts through the wooden slats, and the scent of smoke from distant towns clings to the barracks. Then, unexpectedly, the air changes. From just beyond the wire, faint strains of sound emerge. A phonograph carried by advancing American soldiers begins to play. The music is at first tentative, static crackling, the notes imperfect but unmistakably alive. Swing rhythms, bright brass, and melodic piano fill the air. For the women, this is not background noise. It is a revelation. Faces turn toward the sound, eyes widening. Some press their palms to their mouths, fighting the urge to cry. Others move closer to the source, as if proximity could magnify the reality of what they hear. Each note carries layers of meaning. It is freedom, vitality, and hope made audible. The melody contrasts sharply with the disciplined marches and harsh commands of the past months. It feels impossible yet undeniable, a foreign language that speaks directly to memory and emotion. Tears begin to fall quietly at first, then more openly, as prisoners clutch at one another, whispering fragments of lyrics remembered or imagined. Laughter mingles with sobs, a strange harmony that fills the barracks more fully than any guard's command ever could. The American soldiers, advancing cautiously, pause to watch. Some are aware of the music's effect, having seen similar reactions in liberated towns, yet the intensity surprises even them. They exchange glances, noting the paradox. War has brought destruction, yet through a simple song, life asserts itself. The juxtaposition of devastation and vitality is stark. The prisoners, once silent and subdued, now radiate emotion, movement, and the fragile exhilaration of liberation. For the German guards, the moment is disorienting. Years of authority drilled into them and reinforced by fear unravel before a melody. Some attempt to intervene, shouting orders or gesturing, but the impact is muted. The women do not stop. The music cannot be restrained. The guards' power, once absolute within the confines of the camp, proves vulnerable to the intangible, sound, rhythm, and human response. Observers of the moment, including Allied officers documenting the liberation, noted its intensity. One soldier described it as a transformation more vivid than any battle I've witnessed. The women were no longer prisoners in spirit, even if the wire remained. Diaries from the time echo the same sentiment. Tears, laughter, and wide-eyed wonder dominating the scene. Music had become a catalyst, accelerating the emotional release built up over months, even years of oppression. This moment also reveals the subtle dynamics of human psychology under stress. The sudden contrast between deprivation and sensory abundance, between fear and exhilaration, triggers an overwhelming response. The women's reactions were instinctive, unfiltered by social convention or self-consciousness. In one instant, The private emotional world suppressed by captivity became publicly visible. The camp's atmosphere shifted from tension to awe, from silence to a chorus of responses, all guided by the simple yet profound power of music. The scene is cinematic in every sense. The frozen landscape outside, the dim light in the barracks, the tense movements of soldiers and guards, and above all, the radiant human responses to sound. Every tear, every whispered laugh, every widened eye conveys a story more eloquent than words or documents ever could. The music, carried through static and frost, becomes both witness and participant in this human drama. As the song continues, the prisoners' faces soften, smiles breaking through years of strain, and a sense of shared humanity emerges. In this moment, liberation is both literal and symbolic. The arrival of American forces marks freedom from captivity, while the music marks freedom of the spirit. The stage is now set for the final crescendo of human emotion, a moment that will define the memory of these POWs long after the war ends. Cultural shock and human liberation. As the initial notes filled the barracks, the women's reactions evolved. Shock gave way to recognition to emotion, and emotion to connection. They pressed together, sharing warmth, tears, and laughter in a space that had known only fear. The music created an invisible bridge between the prisoners and the soldiers outside, the sound a living thread linking hope to reality. For some, the rhythms of swing and jazz were entirely new, yet their bodies responded instinctively, tapping fingers, swaying subtly, or lifting faces to the invisible pulse of the melody. The American soldiers, now inside the camp, watched quietly. They were careful not to disturb the fragile emotional moment, understanding that this was as much a victory as any battle. Conversations were hushed, gestures minimal. The liberators had brought freedom, but the music had brought comprehension, the tangible, emotional realization of liberation that no order or command could convey. For the women, the combination of human presence and musical expression transformed abstract hope into lived experience. Some prisoners wept openly, unable to reconcile months of deprivation with this sudden abundance of sound and attention. Others laughed, a release almost uncontainable, born of relief, surprise, and disbelief. Diaries and later interviews reveal that many women described the moment as surreal, a suspension of reality in which time itself seemed to pause. Music, which had once been forbidden or inaccessible, now filled the room with life, energy, and humanity. The psychological impact was profound, a sudden restoration of identity, memory, and dignity after long-term suppression. Even the guards were affected, though differently. Some retreated quietly, stunned at the visible demonstration of emotion and autonomy. Others simply watched, powerless to intervene, as the women's response highlighted the limits of control that authority can wield over the human spirit. In a war defined by hierarchy, order, and obedience, this moment demonstrated the vulnerability of those structures when confronted with the intangible: sound, memory, and feeling. The cultural shock was not limited to immediate emotions. The women had lived in an isolated, strictly controlled environment where foreign media was rare, and foreign music rarer still. The melodies they now heard contained elements that were unfamiliar: syncopated rhythms, improvisation, bright brass, and piano trills. These sounds carried a vitality completely absent from the regimented life of the camp. For many, it was a revelation that music could be expressive, joyful, and liberating. The cognitive dissonance, the clash between deprivation and abundance, oppression and freedom, heightened the intensity of the emotional response. In the hours that followed, the camp transformed. Prisoners moved with renewed energy, talking quietly among themselves about the music, recalling snippets of songs and comparing what they remembered with what they heard now. The barracks, once silent and tense, resonated with sound and conversation. Music had become both an emotional and social catalyst, facilitating communication, bonding, and a collective sense of humanity that had been largely suppressed. Symbolically, this moment marked more than the liberation of a camp. It illustrated the enduring power of culture to transcend conflict, oppression, and fear. The melodies carried a message that words alone could not convey: that life persists, that joy is possible, and that freedom is not just a political or military state but an emotional and psychological reality. For the women, each note served as proof that they had survived not just physically but spiritually. capable of feeling, responding, and reclaiming pieces of themselves long buried under the weight of captivity. By the end of that day, the barracks had become a theater of transformation. Soldiers and prisoners shared space, music, and the first sense of normalcy in months, if not years. The emotional crescendo, the crying, laughter, awe, and subtle movements of recognition would remain etched in memory, a defining moment in the history of the camp and in each woman's life. The music had completed its work, liberation of spirit alongside liberation of body. This moment, a convergence of sound, emotion, and human connection, set the stage for the aftermath. What followed was the practical, physical reality of liberation, care, repatriation, and the slow process of recovery. But even in these processes, the impact of music and the emotional release it induced left an indelible imprint, shaping interactions and expectations in ways that official records alone cannot capture. Immediate consequences. By late March 1945, the POW camp was fully under Allied control. Guards had surrendered or fled, leaving behind the prisoners and the remnants of a failing regime. The first tangible signs of liberation were practical: the distribution of food, medical attention, and the restoration of basic necessities. For many women, the simplest provisions, bread, warm blankets, fresh water, felt miraculous after months of deprivation. Yet it was not only physical relief that defined the immediate aftermath. The emotional landscape had shifted as dramatically as the physical one. Soldiers and medical personnel documented the profound human impact of liberation. Accounts describe women sitting together, weeping, laughing, and whispering memories of life before captivity. Some had never imagined they would survive to see freedom, and the emotional release was both overwhelming and visible. The music they had heard upon liberation became intertwined with these moments, a persistent reminder of hope and resilience. For many, recalling that first broadcast was more vivid than recalling the sight of approaching soldiers. It had crystallized the intangible meaning of liberation, the validation of survival, the affirmation of identity, and the restoration of human dignity. Statistical records highlight the scale of deprivation faced by these women. Medical examinations revealed malnutrition, frostbite, and untreated illnesses in a significant portion of the population. Deaths in the months preceding liberation were often caused by a combination of exhaustion, starvation, and disease. Allied reports noted that recovery would require both sustained medical intervention and careful psychological support. Music, though not a remedy in the conventional sense, had already initiated the psychological healing process. The emotional release it induced allowed prisoners to process months of fear, loss, and uncertainty, preparing them to face the practical challenges of repatriation. Interactions between liberated prisoners and soldiers reveal further dimensions of the aftermath. Many women initially struggled to communicate, their voices weak from months of suppression. Soldiers, trained for combat rather than caregiving, were struck by the intensity of the responses: tears, whispered expressions of gratitude, and spontaneous laughter. Music often became a bridge in these early interactions. Songs were replayed, hummed, or shared among groups, easing tension and establishing a shared sense of humanity. The liberators themselves noted the power of this cultural exchange. The sound of music, they realized, had facilitated trust and emotional recovery in ways words alone could not. Even within the camp's structures, authority had shifted. The hierarchy that had governed every movement, every action had been dismantled. Where once guards maintained control through fear and punishment, now the prisoners moved freely, choosing where to sit, what to eat, and how to interact. This newfound autonomy, combined with the ongoing presence of music, underscored the human capacity to reclaim agency after prolonged oppression. The first notes of American songs were no longer just a stimulus, they were a symbol of liberation, guiding the prisoners into the unfamiliar but life-affirming experience of choice. Amid the immediate relief, soldiers and officers recognized the importance of documenting these experiences. Diaries, reports, and later interviews preserved the details of emotional and psychological responses. Accounts emphasized the combination of exhaustion, elation, and disbelief, noting that many women described the experience as unreal, or like waking from a long nightmare. Music, universally accessible and deeply affecting, became a recurring theme in these testimonies, its impact resonating beyond the day of liberation and shaping how survivors recalled their captivity. By the end of those first days, the camp had shifted from a space of oppression to one of cautious recovery. Food, medical attention, and freedom marked the initial steps. But the emotional and cultural dimensions, the laughter, tears, and melodies, left an equally indelible impression. Liberation was both external and internal. Soldiers had dismantled the physical restraints, but music had unlocked the human spirit. Broader implications and historical records beyond the immediate relief and emotional release, the broader implications of the POW's experience with music became evident in the weeks and months following liberation. Repatriation processes began slowly, as Allied forces coordinated the transport of prisoners back to their home countries. For many women, this transition was fraught with logistical challenges, disrupted families, destroyed homes, and lingering health issues. Yet the emotional groundwork laid by the first musical broadcasts helped ease the psychological burden of this journey. Music had served as a bridge between captivity and freedom, reminding the women that life outside the barbed wire still existed and that joy could survive even in the aftermath of trauma. Historical records and memoirs from the period underscore the lasting significance of these experiences. One French prisoner in a post-war interview described the first strains of swing music as a voice of the world I thought I had lost forever. Soviet survivors recounted similar experiences, noting that the melodies had temporarily suspended their fear and reminded them of home. Allied soldiers documented the phenomenon as well, recording both the reactions of the prisoners and the subtle disruptions caused among German guards. These accounts collectively reveal a pattern. Music acted as both a psychological catalyst and a marker of liberation, leaving impressions that persisted long after physical confinement ended. From a military and cultural perspective, these events illuminate the underestimated power of intangible forces in warfare. Historians have noted that Allied psychological operations often leveraged music, radio broadcasts, and leaflets to influence both civilian and prisoner morale. While the liberating soldiers may not have intended the full emotional impact of the musical broadcasts, their effect was profound. The first American songs heard by the female POWs were more than entertainment. They were a form of soft power that reinforced liberation, restored human dignity, and offered a model for understanding the intersection of culture and military strategy. The long-term effects on the prisoners were equally significant. Beyond the initial euphoria, the experience reinforced resilience and provided a psychological anchor during repatriation. Survivors often referenced music in their later lives as a symbol of endurance and hope. Wartime trauma is not easily erased, but these auditory experiences created enduring emotional touchstones, reminders that even in extreme adversity, moments of beauty and connection could exist. In some cases, music inspired renewed social engagement, storytelling, and community building among survivors, serving as a foundation for healing after years of isolation and oppression. Culturally, the events offer insight into the universality of music as a human experience. Regardless of nationality, language, or previous exposure, the melodies resonated deeply. They bridged divides, creating a shared human moment that transcended the barriers imposed by war, ideology, and hierarchy. Music functioned as a medium of communication, conveying emotions that words often failed to express, providing a means of connecting the women to each other, to the liberators, and to the wider world beyond the camp. The symbolic power of these experiences cannot be overstated. The tears, laughter, and stunned silence of the female POWs reveal the profound emotional impact of liberation, not only in physical terms but in human terms. The act of listening, responding, and connecting through sound became a pivotal part of their recovery, and by extension, a small but telling chapter in the larger history of World War II. By integrating historical records, personal accounts, and cultural analysis, we gain a fuller understanding of how something as simple as a musical broadcast could resonate through the layers of captivity, liberation, and long-term memory. The immediate aftermath, the nourishment, medical care, and freedom, was inseparable from the emotional and cultural liberation initiated by those first American melodies. Music, in this context, emerges as both a historical artifact and a psychological tool, marking the intersection of human resilience, cultural power, and the lived experience of war. These insights prepare us to reflect on the larger meaning of this event, the endurance of hope, the power of human expression, and the ways in which ordinary acts like playing a song can leave extraordinary marks on history. The story of these female POWs, crying at the first strains of American music, is more than a wartime anecdote. It is a testament to the enduring power of human spirit. In the harshest conditions, when survival is measured in meals and minutes, the intangible, sound, memory, emotion, can become the strongest lifeline. Music, in its simplest form, became a bridge from captivity to freedom, from fear to hope, from silence to expression. It reminded the women that life persisted beyond the barbed wire, that humanity could not be fully suppressed, and that beauty could exist even amid destruction. This moment also speaks to the subtle forces that shape history. While wars are often recorded through battles, strategies, and statistics, the influence of culture, emotion, and human connection is no less decisive. A melody carried across a frozen camp could dismantle the psychological chains of captivity, inspire resilience, and leave an imprint that lasts a lifetime. It is a reminder that liberation is not solely the removal of physical barriers. It is the reclamation of identity, dignity, and the capacity to feel fully alive. There is a quiet heroism in these tears, the courage to respond openly after months of fear, the bravery to embrace vulnerability in a world that demanded silence. Music became a companion, a witness, and a healer, transforming a bleak, frozen barracks into a space of human connection. For historians and viewers alike, it illustrates how ordinary human experiences, listening, feeling, remembering, intersect with the extraordinary circumstances of war to create moments of profound significance. Ultimately, this story endures because it speaks to something universal: the resilience of the human heart and the power of art to affirm life even in the darkest hours. These women, momentarily freed by sound, teach us that hope, beauty, and humanity are never entirely lost, even in the midst of conflict. In their tears and laughter, we witness not only the cost of war, but the indomitable capacity of people to feel, to remember, and to reclaim their spirits when liberation finally arrives.